Sometimes the most ordinary moments become extraordinary when we least expect them. A simple walk to the grocery store, a routine bus ride, or in this case, a quiet evening stroll through the park can change everything in an instant. What would you do if strangers suddenly surrounded you, demanding something you've carried close to your heart for decades? Would you fight back, or would you let them discover the one thing that could transform their entire understanding of who you really are? This is the story of Margaret Chen, an 82-year-old woman whose weathered hands held secrets that three young strangers never saw coming. It's about a moment when desperation met dignity, when assumptions crumbled in the face of truth, and when a small piece of metal became the bridge between two completely different worlds. What happened that Tuesday evening in Riverside Park wasn't just a crime or a rescue. It was a revelation that would change 5 lives forever. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't what you'd expect. Sometimes, it's simply the truth about who you've always been, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine. Margaret Chen adjusted her worn blue cardigan as she stepped out of Miller's grocery store, the familiar weight of her canvas purse hanging from her shoulder. The Tuesday evening air carried the scent of blooming magnolias, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. At 82, Margaret had learned to appreciate these small moments of beauty, especially after living through times when such simple pleasures seemed impossible. She walked slowly but steadily along Maple Street, her sensible shoes making soft sounds against the cracked sidewalk. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the past decade. Where once stood neat rows of family homes with white picket fences, now there were apartment complexes and empty lots scattered with broken glass and weeds. Margaret didn't judge the transformation harshly. Change was inevitable, she knew, and every generation faced its own struggles. As she approached Riverside Park, Margaret noticed the usual group of teenagers gathered near the old basketball court. Their laughter echoed across the open space, mixing with the distant sound of traffic. She recognized some of their faces from the neighborhood, though she didn't know their names. There was the tall boy with the red sneakers who sometimes helped elderly residents carry their groceries, the girl with the bright purple hair who worked part-time at the corner cafe, and several others she'd seen around but never spoken to directly. Margaret had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people, even when circumstances made them do questionable things. Growing up during wartime had taught her that desperation could drive anyone to make choices they'd never consider under normal circumstances. She'd seen gentle souls become fierce fighters, and she'd witnessed hardened criminals show unexpected kindness when it mattered most. The park's walking path wound through a cluster of oak trees, their massive trunks creating natural shadows as daylight began to fade. Margaret enjoyed this route because it reminded her of the forests back home, thousands of miles away, where she'd spent her childhood before everything changed. The memory of those distant trees always brought a mix of joy and sorrow, like looking at old photographs of people you'd loved and lost. She paused near the fountain in the center of the park, watching the water create small ripples in the basin. A few coins glinted at the bottom, thrown there by hopeful visitors making wishes. Margaret reached into her purse and felt around for a penny, her fingers brushing against the familiar objects she always carried. Her reading glasses in their protective case, a small packet of tissues, her medication organizer, and something else wrapped carefully in soft cloth. Her hand lingered on that wrapped item for just a moment. It was about the size of a silver dollar but heavier, with an irregular surface that her fingers knew by heart after all these years. Margaret had carried it with her for more than 6 decades, through countless moves, difficult times, moments of triumph, and periods of profound loss. Most people would assume it was just another keepsake, perhaps a family coin or a religious medallion. They would be both right and terribly wrong. Finding a penny in her coin purse, Margaret closed her eyes and made the same wish she'd been making for years, not for herself, but for understanding between people who saw the world differently, for patience in times of conflict, for the courage to do what's right when doing what's easy would be so much simpler. She tossed the coin into the fountain and watched it sink slowly through the clear water. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. 3 young people were walking toward her along the path, their voices carrying a tension she hadn't noticed before. They looked to be in their late teens or early 20s, dressed in dark clothing that made them blend into the growing shadows. Something in their body language made Margaret's instincts sharpen, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The first young man was thin with nervous energy, constantly looking around as if expecting trouble. His companion was shorter but more muscular, with tattoos covering his forearms, and a way of walking that suggested coiled aggression. The third member of the group was a young woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. Together, they moved with the coordinated purpose of people who'd worked together before. Margaret continued walking, hoping to reach the park exit before their paths crossed. She wasn't particularly afraid. Fear was an emotion she'd learned to manage long ago, but she was practical. An elderly woman alone in a dimming park was an obvious target for anyone looking for easy money. She quickened her pace slightly, her purse bouncing gently against her hip with each step, but the three strangers adjusted their direction to intercept her path. Margaret realized with growing certainty that this wasn't a coincidence. They'd chosen her specifically, probably because she fit their image of a vulnerable victim, someone who wouldn't fight back, someone who might have a purse full of cash from grocery shopping, someone whose screams wouldn't carry far enough to bring help. The irony wasn't lost on her. Throughout her life, people had consistently underestimated Margaret Chen. They saw a small, elderly Asian woman and made assumptions about her character, her capabilities, and her history. Sometimes those assumptions had worked in her favor, allowing her to surprise people with her strength and determination. Other times, like now, they placed her in danger because predators viewed her as easy prey. As the three figures drew closer, Margaret made a quick decision. Instead of trying to run or change direction, she stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the middle of the path. Running would only confirm their perception of her as a victim. Standing her ground might give them pause, even if just for a moment. In that moment, she might find an opportunity to de-escalate the situation, or at least buy herself time to think. The muscular young man reached her first, stopping just close enough to invade her personal space without quite touching her. His two companions flanked her on either side, forming a loose triangle that blocked her escape routes. Up close, Margaret could see that all three showed signs of desperation. Dark circles under their eyes, clothes that hadn't been washed recently, the hollow look of people who hadn't eaten properly in days. "Evening, Grandma," the muscular one said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't match the tension in his posture. "Nice night for a walk, isn't it?" Margaret looked directly into his eyes without flinching. "Yes, it is. I was just heading home." "Well, that's funny," the young woman said, moving closer on Margaret's left side. "Because we were thinking maybe you could help us out with something first." The thin young man said nothing but kept glancing toward the park entrance, clearly serving as a lookout. His nervousness was almost palpable, suggesting this wasn't something he was comfortable with. Margaret filed that observation away. In any group, the reluctant participant was often the weak link. "What kind of help did you need?" Margaret asked calmly, though her mind was already racing through possibilities. She'd been in dangerous situations before, though admittedly not for many years. The key was staying alert without showing panic, finding ways to connect with their humanity while looking for opportunities to escape or summon help. "The kind that involves your purse," the muscular young man said, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "Hand it over and nobody gets hurt." Margaret's grip tightened slightly on her purse strap, not out of defiance, but out of protective instinct. Everything important to her was in that bag: her identification, her small amount of spending money, her medication, and most importantly, the wrapped items she'd carried for so many decades. Losing the money would be difficult, but manageable. Losing that wrapped treasure would be devastating beyond words. "I don't carry much cash," she said truthfully. "Maybe $12 or $15 for my grocery shopping." "You could probably find more money in the fountain behind us." The young woman laughed harshly. "Funny lady, but we'll take our chances with the purse." Old people always have more hidden away than they admit. Margaret studied their faces, looking for any sign of flexibility or doubt. The muscular young man seemed committed to the robbery, but she could see conflict in the thin lookout's expression. The young woman appeared to be the real leader of the group, making decisions with cold calculation rather than desperate emotion. "I understand you're in a difficult situation," Margaret said quietly. "I've been there myself. But taking my purse won't solve your real problems. It will only create new ones." "Save the lecture, Grandma," the young woman snapped. "We're not here for life advice." But Margaret had noticed something important in that exchange. When she'd mentioned being in difficult situations herself, the thin young man's attention had sharpened. He was listening, even if his companions weren't. Sometimes reaching just one person in a group was enough to change the entire dynamic. "What's your name?" Margaret asked the lookout directly, ignoring his more aggressive companions. The question clearly caught him off guard. "What?" "Why?" "Because in about 30 seconds, you're going to have to decide what kind of person you want to be," Margaret said with quiet intensity. "And I'd like to know the name of someone who's standing at such an important crossroads in his life." The muscular young man stepped closer, clearly annoyed by Margaret's refusal to simply comply. "Enough talking. Give us the purse now, or we'll take it ourselves. Margaret nodded slowly as if accepting defeat. All right. You win. But before I give you my purse, would you like to know what's really inside it? We don't care what's inside it, the young woman said impatiently. We just want it. Oh, but you should care, Margaret replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, because what's in this purse will surprise you more than anything you've ever seen. And once you see it, you'll understand why this conversation is about to change completely. She began to reach for her purse clasp, moving slowly and deliberately. The three young people leaned forward slightly, their attention focused entirely on her hands and the promise of easy money. None of them noticed the sound of approaching footsteps from behind them, or the way Margaret's eyes had briefly flickered towards something beyond their shoulders. What they also didn't notice was the subtle change in Margaret's posture, the way she'd shifted her weight slightly forward, or the fact that her free hand had moved to rest casually near the wrapped item in her purse. After more than 6 decades, she still remembered her training. Some skills, once learned, never truly fade away. The moment of revelation was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them. The muscular young man's patience finally snapped. That's it, he growled, lunging forward to grab Margaret's purse. We're done with games. But Margaret had been expecting this move. In one fluid motion, she stepped sideways and pulled the purse away from his reaching hands, causing him to stumble forward slightly. The movement was so smooth and controlled that it clearly wasn't the reaction of a frightened elderly woman. It was the response of someone who understood combat dynamics. Marcus! Grab her! The young woman shouted, revealing the thin lookout's name in her frustration. Marcus hesitated for a crucial second, torn between following orders and a growing sense that something wasn't right about this situation. That hesitation gave Margaret the opening she needed to position herself better, placing her back toward the fountain, where she had more room to maneuver. The muscular young man recovered quickly and moved toward her again, but this time Margaret was ready with words instead of evasive action. Before you do something you'll regret for the rest of your life, she said with surprising authority, let me show you why you should reconsider. Her tone had changed completely. Gone was the polite grandmother voice. In its place was something harder, more commanding, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations. The change was so dramatic that all three young people stopped moving, instinctively responding to the shift in her demeanor. Margaret slowly opened her purse and reached inside, her movements deliberate and unthreatening, but somehow charged with significance. My name is Margaret Chen, she said, as her fingers found the wrapped item. But 68 years ago, I had a different name, different responsibilities, a different life entirely. She began to unwrap the cloth-covered object, revealing glimpses of something metallic that caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. I was born in a small village outside Shanghai, but I grew up in a world at war. When I was 14, my family was killed in a bombing raid. I survived by hiding in a rice cellar for 3 days. The young woman tried to interrupt, but Margaret's voice cut through any objections. When I finally emerged, my village was gone. Everything I'd known was destroyed. I had 2 choices, die with my old life or find a way to build a new one. She pulled away more of the cloth, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a medal or medallion. I chose to live. But living in wartime meant learning skills that no 14-year-old should have to learn. It meant joining the resistance. It meant becoming someone I'd never imagined I could become. Marcus had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on Margaret's hands. Something about her story was resonating with him in ways the others couldn't see. The young woman, however, remained focused on what she perceived as a distraction technique. We don't care about your sob story, lady, she said, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Just give us the purse and whatever's in your hands. Margaret smiled sadly. What's in my hands is the reason you should care about my story, because it's about to teach you something important about making assumptions based on appearances. She unwrapped the final layer of cloth, revealing a medal unlike anything the 3 young people had ever seen. It wasn't large or flashy, but it emanated a sense of weight and importance that had nothing to do with its physical properties. The metal was dark with age, and intricate symbols were etched around the edges. In the center was an image that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. This, Margaret said, holding the medal up so they could all see it clearly, is the Medal of Military Merit, First Class. It was awarded to me by the Chinese People's Liberation Army in 1959 for actions taken during the final stages of the Chinese Civil War. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as the significance of her words settled over the group. The muscular young man's aggressive posture began to slump as understanding dawned on his face. "You were a soldier?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was many things," Margaret replied gently. "A spy, a saboteur, a communications specialist, a medic, a leader of resistance cells. Whatever my country needed me to be, during some of the most dangerous years in modern Chinese history." She turned the medal over, revealing additional inscriptions on the reverse side. "I spent 4 years operating behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, disrupting supply lines, and coordinating with other resistance groups. I was captured twice and escaped both times. I killed when I had to, saved lives when I could, and learned that survival sometimes requires making impossible choices." The young woman was staring at the medal with a mixture of disbelief and growing comprehension. That's impossible. You're just some old Chinese lady." "Yes, I am," Margaret agreed with a slight smile. "Ha ha 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 ha. I'm also someone who spent her youth fighting trained soldiers with nothing but cleverness, determination, and the absolute certainty that my cause was worth dying for. Do you really think 3 hungry young people are going to intimidate someone who survived what I've survived?" Marcus took an involuntary step backward. "We didn't know. We thought you were just what?" Margaret asked, her tone still gentle but with an edge of steel. "Just another vulnerable old woman? Just someone you could rob without consequences? Just a person whose life and dignity didn't matter?" She carefully rewrapped the medal and placed it back in her purse, but kept her hand resting on the clasp. "Let me tell you what you actually found tonight. You found someone who understands desperation, who knows what it's like to have nothing, and who has spent decades learning how to help people find better solutions to their problems than robbery and violence." The muscular young man's aggression had completely evaporated, replaced by a confusion that bordered on shame. "We're sorry. We didn't mean to. We're just really hungry, and we don't have anywhere to sleep tonight, and—" "I know," Margaret said simply. "I've been there. Different circumstances, different country, different war, but I understand what desperation feels like. The question now is, what are you going to do with this moment?" She gestured toward the medal hidden in her purse. "I could have shown you this immediately and avoided this entire confrontation. I could have intimidated you from the start, but I wanted to give you the chance to make the right choice on your own. To discover that you're better people than your circumstances are forcing you to pretend to be." The young woman found her voice again, though it was much quieter than before. "What? What do you mean?" "I mean that you're standing at a crossroads," Margaret explained. "Right now, you can walk away from this park as 3 people who attempted armed robbery and failed. Or you can walk away as 3 people who met someone willing to help them find better solutions to their problems." Marcus looked up hopefully. "You would help us?" "After what we just tried to do to you." Margaret studied his face carefully, seeing past the desperation to the person underneath. "Marcus, isn't it? How old are you?"
19, he admitted.
"When I was 19, I was living in caves and eating whatever food we could steal from enemy supply convoys. I was wanted by 3 different armies and had a price on my head that could have fed a family for a year. I thought I understood how bad life could get." She paused, letting that image sink in. "But I also had something that kept me going through those impossible times. I had a purpose. I had people who needed me. I had the knowledge that what I was doing mattered, even when it seemed hopeless." The muscular young man seemed smaller now, less threatening and more lost. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe instead of taking my purse tonight, you could let me buy you dinner. And while we eat, you could tell me about what's really going on in your lives. And maybe, just maybe, we could figure out some better options than robbery." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. It was so unexpected, so contrary to how this encounter was supposed to unfold, that none of the 3 young people seemed to know how to respond. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces, pride warring with hunger, suspicion battling with hope, the ingrained belief that adults in authority would inevitably disappoint them, competing with the desperate desire to trust someone who might actually understand their situation. "Why would you do that?" the young woman asked finally. "We just tried to rob you." "Because 68 years ago, someone showed me kindness when I desperately needed it," Margaret replied. "A farmer found me half dead in his field, and instead of turning me over to the authorities for the reward money, he fed me and gave me shelter until I was strong enough to continue my mission. He probably saved my life." She adjusted her purse strap and took a small step toward the park exit. That farmer taught me something important. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose compassion over fear. Choose understanding over judgment. Choose to see potential instead of problems. Marcus looked at his two companions, seeking some kind of consensus. The internal dynamics of their group were shifting rapidly as the reality of Margaret's revelation continued to sink in. This wasn't how robberies were supposed to go. Victims weren't supposed to offer help. They weren't supposed to have military decorations from foreign wars. They weren't supposed to understand desperation from personal experience. There's a diner about 2 blocks from here, Margaret continued conversationally. Nothing fancy, but the food is good and the coffee is strong. The owner knows me, so we won't have any problems finding a quiet table where we can talk properly. She began walking toward the park exit, not looking back to see if they would follow. It was a calculated risk, but one based on decades of reading people and understanding human psychology. She'd given them a choice between their original plan and something completely unexpected. The decision they made would reveal not just what they were willing to do, but who they really were underneath their desperation. Behind her, she heard whispered conversation as the 3 young people debated their options. Part of her wondered if she was being foolishly optimistic, if her faith in human nature was about to be severely tested. But a larger part of her knew that this was exactly the kind of moment that defined people's lives, for better or worse. The footsteps that began following her a few seconds later told her everything she needed to know about the choice they'd made. The Lucky Star Diner occupied a corner building that had seen better decades, its red vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floors speaking to an era when diners were community gathering places rather than nostalgic curiosities. Margaret pushed through the glass door, hearing the familiar chime that announced arrivals, and breathed in the comforting aroma of coffee and grilled onions that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. "Evening, Margaret," called Rosa from behind the counter, her warm smile faltering slightly as she noticed the 3 young people following Margaret inside. Rosa had owned the Lucky Star for 15 years and had developed sharp instincts about potential trouble. These 3 looked exactly like the kind of customers who might cause problems. "Hello, Rosa," Margaret replied calmly. "Could we have booth 7? And perhaps some coffee to start?" Rosa's expression shifted as she processed Margaret's composed demeanor and the fact that she was clearly with these young people by choice rather than by force. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and gestured toward the back corner booth Margaret had requested. The booth was positioned perfectly for conversation, far enough from other customers to provide privacy, but visible enough to the rest of the diner that Rosa could keep an eye on things. Margaret slid onto the worn vinyl seat facing the door, a habit ingrained from decades of situational awareness training. The 3 young people arranged themselves across from her, their discomfort obvious in their nervous glances and fidgeting hands. Marcus sat closest to the window, his thin frame hunched forward, as if he was ready to flee at any moment. The muscular young man, who had introduced himself as Derek during the walk to the diner, kept looking around the restaurant as if assessing escape routes. The young woman, who'd given her name as Sarah, sat rigidly upright, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "I haven't eaten in a real restaurant in months," Marcus admitted quietly, studying the laminated menu with an intensity that spoke to genuine hunger rather than casual interest. Margaret felt a familiar pang in her chest, the recognition of desperation she'd experienced countless times during her own difficult years. "Order whatever you want," she said simply. "Tonight, food is not a concern." Rosa approached their table with a coffee pot and 4 mugs, her movements cautious but professional. She'd clearly decided to trust Margaret's judgment, though her eyes continued to monitor the 3 young strangers with practiced vigilance. "The usual for you, Margaret?" Rosa asked as she poured coffee for everyone. "Actually, I think I'll have the meatloaf tonight," Margaret replied. "It's been a day for breaking routines." As Rosa took their orders, Derek requesting a double cheeseburger with obvious hunger, Sarah choosing a grilled chicken sandwich, and Marcus asking for pancakes because he'd been craving them for weeks, Margaret observed the subtle changes in their behavior. The simple act of ordering food in a warm, well-lit restaurant was beginning to humanize them to themselves. They were remembering what it felt like to be customers rather than criminals, people with legitimate needs rather than desperate predators. "So," Margaret said after Rosa had departed with their orders, "tell me your story. How did 3 young people end up attempting robbery in Riverside Park on a Tuesday evening?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice carrying a defensive edge that couldn't quite hide her underlying vulnerability. "It's not like we planned it," she said, staring down at her coffee mug. "We're not criminals, we're just stuck." "Stuck how?" Margaret asked gently, her tone encouraging without being pushy. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I was working construction until the company went under 3 months ago. Couldn't make rent, got evicted, been sleeping in my car when I can afford gas. Sleeping rough when I can't. Marcus nodded in agreement. I aged out of foster care last year. Was staying with different friends, but you can only do that for so long before people get tired of helping. Sarah and I met at a job fair that turned out to be completely useless. Every application asks for an address, Sarah added bitterly. Hard to get a job when you don't have a home. Hard to get a home when you don't have a job. It's like being stuck in a circle that just keeps getting smaller.
Margaret listened without interrupting, recognizing the familiar pattern of circumstances that could trap anyone, regardless of their character or intentions.
During her years working with various community organizations after immigrating to America, she'd heard similar stories countless times.
The specifics changed, but the underlying dynamic remained constant. One piece of bad luck leading to another, until people found themselves in situations they'd never imagined possible. How long have you been on the streets? She asked. 2 weeks for me, Derek admitted. God, been close to homeless for months. About 6 weeks, Sarah replied. Marcus and I have been looking out for each other. 4 months, Marcus said quietly. It's harder than you think it's going to be. Everything costs money, even the stuff you never thought about. Want to use a public bathroom? Half the places make you buy something first. Need to wash your clothes? Laundromat costs $8 minimum. Trying to look presentable for job interviews when you're sleeping outside is basically impossible. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And tonight was the first time you'd tried robbery? The 3 young people exchanged glances before Derek answered. Yeah. We were just so hungry, and Sarah had heard that people walking through that park sometimes carried cash from grocery shopping. We thought it would be easy. We're not violent people, Sarah added quickly. We weren't going to hurt you. We just needed money for food. Margaret sipped her coffee slowly, organizing her thoughts. Can I tell you about the first time I stole something? Their attention sharpened immediately. Somehow, hearing that this dignified elderly woman had once been desperate enough to steal was both shocking and comforting. I was 15, Margaret began. I'd been hiding in the mountains for 6 months, living with a small group of other refugees. Winter was coming, and we had no proper shelter, no warm clothes, and very little food. I volunteered to sneak into a nearby village to steal whatever supplies we could find. She paused as Rosa arrived with their food, waiting until they had privacy again before continuing. I was terrified. I'd never stolen anything in my life. But I also knew that without those supplies, some of us, probably including me, wouldn't survive until spring. Marcus leaned forward, caught up in her story. What happened? I successfully stole a bag of rice, some winter clothes, and a small cooking pot, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. I also got caught by a village patrol on my way back to our hiding place. Derek paused with his burger halfway to his mouth. They caught you? They did. And that's when I learned something important about the difference between surviving and living. Margaret cut a piece of her meatloaf before continuing. The patrol leader could have turned me over to the authorities. Instead, he listened to my story. He looked at this skinny, scared teenager and made a decision that changed my entire life. She took a bite and chewed thoughtfully, letting the suspense build. He told me that if I wanted to fight the occupation, I should do it properly. He introduced me to the local resistance network. Within a month, I was training as a communications specialist. Within 6 months, I was running my own operations. Sarah had stopped eating entirely, absorbed in Margaret's narrative. So stealing led to you joining the resistance? Not exactly, Margaret corrected gently. Getting caught stealing led to me finding a better way to channel my anger and desperation. The difference is crucial. She gestured towards their meal. Right now, you 3 are where I was when I got caught, at a crossroads between survival and something more meaningful. You can continue down the path that led you to attempt robbery tonight, or you can let me help you find better alternatives. What kind of alternatives? Derek asked skeptically. We've tried everything. Job applications, social services, shelters, food banks. The system isn't designed to help people like us. Margaret smiled. The system isn't, you're right about that. But people are different from systems, and there are more people willing to help than you might think, if you know how to find them and how to ask. She pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through her contacts list. I know someone who runs a transitional housing program specifically for young adults aging out of foster care or experiencing sudden homelessness. I know someone else who manages a restaurant that hires people without permanent addresses, pays cash daily, and provides one meal per shift. I know a woman who runs a free laundry service for homeless individuals twice a week. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. Why would you help us with all this? We literally just tried to rob you an hour ago. Margaret set down her phone and looked each of them in the eye before answering. Because I understand something about human nature that took me many years to learn. People aren't inherently good or bad. They're inherently adaptable. Put someone in impossible circumstances and they'll do things they never thought they could do. But give them better options, and most people will choose those options. She picked up her coffee mug again, using the pause to let her words sink in. You three proved that tonight. When given the choice between robbery and accepting help, you chose help. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Derek was struggling with conflicting emotions, his tough exterior beginning to crack under the weight of unexpected kindness. But why you?
What makes you want to help strangers? Margaret's expression grew serious.
Because I know what it's like to have strangers help me when I desperately needed it.
And because I've learned that the best way to honor the kindness people showed me is to pass it forward to others who need it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, already starting to write down names and phone numbers. Tomorrow morning, we're going to make some calls. We're going to get you connected with resources you didn't know existed. And we're going to start building a plan for getting your lives back on track. Sarah finally found her voice. You would really do all that? For us? Not just for you, Margaret replied with a gentle smile. With you. Because the most important thing you need to understand is that accepting help isn't the same as being helpless. You're going to work for everything you get. You're going to prove that the people who help you made the right choice. And someday, when you're stable again, you're going to help other people the way I'm helping you tonight. The transformation in their faces was remarkable. Hope was beginning to replace desperation. Possibility was pushing aside resignation, and dignity was returning to people who'd been ground down by circumstances beyond their control. But Margaret knew this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood outside the New Horizons Transitional Housing Facility, watching Derek carry the last box of donated work clothes up the front steps. The morning sun created long shadows across the sidewalk, and the autumn air carried the promise of changing seasons. What struck Margaret most was how different the three young people looked compared to their first meeting in Riverside Park. Derek had gained weight, his face fuller and healthier looking, without the gaunt desperation that had defined his appearance that Tuesday evening. More importantly, his posture had changed. Instead of the coiled aggression of someone expecting trouble, he now moved with the confident purpose of someone who had meaningful work and a place to sleep each night. Mrs. Chen, you didn't have to bring all this stuff, he called out, gesturing to the boxes of donated items Margaret had collected from her network of friends and community contacts. Stop calling me Mrs. Davy. Chen, Margaret replied with mock sternness, the same conversation they'd had dozens of times over the past few weeks. Margaret is fine. And yes, I did have to bring these things. How else am I supposed to keep myself busy in retirement? The joke had become a running theme in their relationship. Margaret's version of retirement seemed to involve more activity and responsibility than most people's careers. Since taking Derek, Marcus, and Sarah under her wing, she'd become a one-woman social services agency, connecting not just them, but several other homeless individuals to resources throughout the city. Marcus emerged from the building, his face bright with excitement. Margaret, you have to see this. They have a computer lab where I can work on my GED online, and Mr. Peterson said once I finish, he knows someone at the community college who can help with financial aid applications. Margaret felt the familiar warm glow of satisfaction that came from watching people rediscover their potential. Marcus had revealed himself to be remarkably intelligent once his basic needs were met, and he could focus on something beyond daily survival. He'd thrown himself into studying with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. That's wonderful news, Margaret said, meaning every word. Have you decided what you want to study? Social work, Marcus replied without hesitation. I want to help other kids aging out of foster care, maybe prevent some of them from going through what I went through. The transformation in Marcus had been the most dramatic of the three. The nervous, desperate young man who'd served as lookout during their attempted robbery had revealed himself to be thoughtful, ambitious, and deeply empathetic. He'd taken to calling Margaret for advice on everything from study schedules to relationship problems with a girl he'd met at the transitional housing facility. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wearing the uniform from her new job at Rose's restaurant.
The Lucky Star Diner had become an unexpected source of employment opportunities after Margaret had introduced Sarah to Rosa as someone who needed a chance to prove herself. Rosa, who had initially been suspicious of the three young people, had gradually become one of their strongest advocates.
"I have to leave for my shift in 10 minutes, Sarah announced, "but I wanted to show you this first." She pulled out her phone and displayed a bank account app showing a balance of $847. For most people, it would be a modest amount, but for someone who'd been homeless 6 weeks earlier, it represented security, dignity, and the foundation of a sustainable future. "I should have enough for a security deposit on an apartment by next month," Sarah continued, her voice carrying a pride that Margaret found deeply moving. "A real apartment, with my own lease and everything." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Have you been looking at places? There's a studio about 15 minutes from the restaurant that seems perfect. It's not fancy, but it's clean and safe, and the landlord said my work history at the diner is sufficient for approval." The practical details of rebuilding their lives had proven to be both simpler and more complex than any of them had anticipated. Finding housing, employment, and educational opportunities wasn't impossible, but it required navigation through bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to frustrate people who were already struggling. Margaret's role had evolved into part advocate, part translator, and part cheerleader as she helped them decode everything from rental applications to health insurance enrollment. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Derek said, settling onto the front steps of the transitional housing facility. 3 weeks ago, I was sleeping in my car and planning to rob random strangers for food money. Now I have a job doing construction work I actually enjoy, a bed to sleep in, and enough money to start saving for my own place." Margaret sat down beside him, something she'd learned to do over the past few weeks. These informal conversations, often held on steps or park benches, had become some of her most treasured moments. They reminded her of similar talks she'd had decades earlier with fellow resistance fighters, sharing hopes and fears in quiet moments between operations.
The circumstances changed, Margaret observed.
"But you were always capable of this life. You just needed the opportunity to show it." "No," Derek disagreed firmly. "That's not true. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look at an elderly woman and see nothing but a potential victim. You didn't just give us opportunities, you reminded us who we really were underneath all the desperation." Margaret considered his words carefully. Over the past few weeks, she'd come to understand that the impact of that Tuesday evening had been mutual. Helping these three young people had reminded her of aspects of her own identity that had been dormant for too long. "Can I tell you something?" she said eventually. "I haven't felt this useful in years. Since my husband died 5 years ago, I've been going through the motions of life without really living. Volunteering at the library, attending community meetings, managing my small social circle, it was all fine, but it wasn't meaningful in the way that meaningful used to feel." Sarah checked her phone for the time but made no move to leave for work.
What do you mean?
"I mean that for most of my adult life, I defined myself by my ability to solve problems that seemed impossible. During the war, that meant intelligence gathering and sabotage operations. After immigrating to America, that meant learning a new language, finding work, building a life from nothing. Later, it meant raising children and building a career and being a useful member of my community." Margaret paused, watching a group of children play in a nearby park. "But as I got older, especially after retiring, I started to feel like I was just existing. Taking up space. Going through familiar routines without any real purpose." Marcus sat down on the other side of Margaret, creating an informal circle on the front steps. "And helping us changed that. Helping you reminded me that I still have skills that matter," Margaret replied. "That my experience still has value. That there are still problems in the world that need solving, and I'm still capable of contributing to those solutions." Derek grinned. "So basically, we saved each other." "That's exactly what happened," Margaret agreed. "Though I'm fairly certain I got the better end of the deal." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a taxi, from which emerged a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor and a warm smile. Margaret stood up immediately, recognizing Janet Walsh from their phone conversations, but meeting her in person for the first time. "You must be Margaret," Janet said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "I've heard incredible things about the work you've been doing with these young people." Janet was a social worker who specialized in transitional programs for homeless youth. Margaret had contacted her after realizing that Derek, Marcus, and Sarah's success story could potentially be replicated with other young people in similar circumstances. What had started as a request for advice had evolved into a proposal for a more systematic approach to addressing youth homelessness. "Janet, thank you for coming," Margaret said. "I'd like you to meet Derek, Marcus, and Sarah." They're the reason I wanted to speak with you about expanding the support network for homeless youth in our community. As introductions were made, Margaret observed the easy confidence with which the three young people interacted with Janet. They were no longer the desperate, defensive individuals she'd met in Riverside Park. They'd rediscovered their ability to present themselves professionally, to advocate for their own needs, and to contribute meaningfully to conversations about solutions. I understand you three have some ideas about how to improve services for young people experiencing homelessness, Janet said, pulling out a notebook and pen.
We do, Sarah replied immediately. We've been thinking about this a lot, actually.
The biggest problems aren't just the obvious ones like housing and jobs, it's the smaller stuff that no one talks about.
Derek nodded enthusiastically. Like having a safe place to store your belongings while you're job hunting, or being able to shower and do laundry regularly enough to maintain professional appearance, or having an address where you can receive mail so employers can contact you.
And having someone who understands the system help you navigate it, Marcus added. Margaret didn't just give us money or food.
She taught us how to access resources we didn't even know existed. She made phone calls with us so we'd know what questions to ask and what information to provide. Janet was taking detailed notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated her genuine interest in their perspectives. Margaret watched with growing excitement as she realized that the conversation was heading exactly where she'd hoped it would.
What I'm hearing, Janet said after 20 minutes of discussion, is that you've essentially created an informal mentorship program that addresses both immediate needs and long-term stability. Is that accurate?
That's one way to put it, Margaret replied.
Though I'd say it's more like we've discovered that connecting people to existing resources is more effective when it's done by someone who has time to provide individualized attention and follow-up support. Janet closed her notebook and looked directly at Margaret. Would you be interested in discussing the possibility of formalizing this approach? My agency has been looking for ways to improve our success rates with transitional housing programs, and what you've accomplished with these three young people is exactly what we've been hoping to achieve. The offer hung in the air like a doorway to possibilities Margaret hadn't even considered. The idea of turning her informal helping into something systematic and sustainable was both exciting and daunting.
But as she looked at Derek, Marcus and Sarah, all of whom were nodding encouragingly, Margaret felt the same sense of purpose and determination that had carried her through her most challenging years.
Yes, she said firmly.
I would be very interested in that discussion. 6 months after that transformative Tuesday evening in Riverside Park, Margaret stood before a room full of social workers, community organizers, and local government officials, holding the same medal that had changed 5 lives in ways none of them could have imagined. But tonight, she wasn't showing it as a symbol of past military service.
Tonight, it represented something entirely different. This medal, Margaret said to the assembled crowd, taught me that our assumptions about people are often completely wrong. When I showed this to 3 young strangers 6 months ago, they assumed I was just a vulnerable elderly woman with an interesting trinket. I assumed they were dangerous criminals with no regard for others' well-being. We were all wrong. The room was packed beyond capacity for the official launch of the Second Chances Mentorship Program, a collaboration between Margaret's grassroots efforts and the city's Social Services Department. Representatives from local businesses, community organizations, and news media filled every available seat, with additional attendees standing along the walls. Derek sat in the front row, wearing a suit that Margaret had helped him select for his new position as a construction foreman trainee.
Beside him, Marcus clutched a certificate of GED completion, his acceptance letter to community college folded carefully in his jacket pocket. Sarah occupied the seat next to Marcus, her manager's badge from the Lucky Star Diner, catching the light as she applauded Margaret's introduction.
The Second Chances program is based on a simple premise, Margaret continued, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once commanded resistance operations. That people facing homelessness and unemployment don't need charity. They need partnership. They need someone willing to invest time and attention in helping them navigate systems that weren't designed with their success in mind. Janet Walsh approached the podium to provide the official program details, but Margaret's attention was drawn to the back of the room, where she noticed several familiar faces from the past 6 months. There was Robert, a veteran she'd helped connect with housing services after finding him sleeping behind the community centre. Lisa, a single mother who'd lost her apartment after a medical emergency led to job loss.
James, a teenager who'd aged out of foster care with no family support system. Each person represented a story similar to Derek, Marcus, and Sarah's, individuals whose circumstances had temporarily overwhelmed their capabilities, but whose potential remained intact underneath the immediate crisis. The informal network Margaret had built over the past months now included 37 people in various stages of transition from homelessness to stability. The mentorship model differs from traditional social services in several important ways, Janet was explaining to the audience. First, mentors work with individuals for as long as necessary, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, rather than providing one-time assistance. Second, mentors provide holistic support that addresses not just housing and employment, but also emotional needs, life skills development, and long-term planning. Margaret nodded approvingly as Janet outlined the program structure they developed together. The official version maintained all the personal attention and individualized approach that had made Margaret's informal efforts so successful, while adding professional oversight and sustainable funding mechanisms. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Janet continued, the program recognizes that people experiencing homelessness are experts in their own lives and circumstances. Mentors don't impose solutions, they collaborate with individuals to identify goals and develop strategies for achieving them. The approach had emerged from countless conversations between Margaret and the people she'd helped over the past months. Traditional social services, while well-intentioned, often felt impersonal and bureaucratic to people who were already feeling isolated and powerless. Margaret's model emphasized relationship building, dignity preservation, and individual empowerment in ways that transformed the entire dynamic of helping and being helped. When Janet finished her presentation, Mayor Davidson took the podium to announce the city's commitment to funding the program's expansion. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as she realized her turn to speak was approaching. Public speaking had never been her favorite aspect of community organizing, though she'd learned to manage it effectively over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Davidson said, I'd like to introduce someone whose dedication and innovation have made this program possible. Margaret Chen has shown us that age is no barrier to making a difference, that one person's commitment can transform an entire community's approach to social challenges. Please join me in welcoming the woman who turned a chance encounter into a movement. The applause was warm and sustained as Margaret returned to the podium. She looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that represented every segment of her adopted community. Business owners who'd committed to hiring program participants, landlords who'd agreed to work with people without traditional rental histories, volunteers who'd offered everything from transportation assistance to professional mentoring. 6 months ago, Margaret began, I thought I understood what retirement was supposed to look like. Quiet days, simple routines, gradual withdrawal from the complexities of community involvement. I was wrong about that, just as I was wrong about many other things. She paused, catching sight of Derek, Marcus, and Sarah in the front row. Their presence gave her the confidence to continue with complete honesty. When I showed 3 young strangers my military medal that evening in Riverside Park, I was trying to shock them out of committing a crime. What I didn't expect was that the experience would shock me out of my own complacency about the difference one person can make. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out the medal, holding it up so everyone in the room could see it. This medal represents 4 years of my life when I fought against seemingly impossible odds for something I believed in. But the past 6 months have taught me that the fight for human dignity and opportunity doesn't end when formal wars conclude. She gestured toward the back of the room where Robert, Lisa, James, and other program participants were standing. These individuals have taught me that heroism isn't limited to military service. Rebuilding your life after losing everything requires just as much courage as any battlefield. Maintaining hope when systems seem designed to frustrate your efforts requires just as much determination as any resistance operation. The room had grown completely quiet, with even the media representatives setting down their cameras to listen more carefully. The Second Chances program succeeds because it recognizes something fundamental about human nature, Margaret continued. That most people, given genuine opportunity and appropriate support, will choose hope over despair, cooperation over conflict, building over destruction. But that choice requires more than good intentions. It requires sustained commitment from people willing to see potential where others see problems. She looked directly at Derek, Marcus, and Sarah as she spoke her next words. The 3 young people who tried to rob me 6 months ago have become 3 of my closest friends and most trusted advisors. They've taught me that redemption is always possible, that second chances can become first opportunities, and that the most powerful force for change is often simple human kindness applied consistently over time. Margaret paused to collect her thoughts before delivering her closing remarks. This medal used to represent my past accomplishments. Today, it represents our future possibilities. Because every person in this room has the opportunity to be someone else's chance encounter, someone else's unexpected kindness, someone else's reason to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. She stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause, but her attention was immediately drawn to Derek, Marcus, and Sarah, who had stood up and were applauding with obvious pride and affection. The sight of them, healthy, confident, and purposeful, reminded Margaret why the past 6 months had been among the most meaningful of her entire life. As the formal program concluded and people began mingling over refreshments, Margaret found herself surrounded by program participants, volunteers, and community members wanting to share their own stories and express their gratitude. But through the crowd, she kept catching glimpses of Derek, Marcus, and Sarah as they talked animatedly with other young people about their experiences and the resources available through the new program. "Margaret," a voice said behind her. She turned to find Dr. Williams, the director of the community center where the program would be headquartered. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've made possible tonight, but I also wanted to ask you something." Margaret nodded encouragingly. "How did you know, Dr. Pence?" Williams asked. "That evening in the park, how did you know that showing them your medal would change everything?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I was taking a calculated risk based on decades of experience reading people and understanding human psychology. But honestly, it could have gone completely differently." She paused, watching Derek help an elderly program volunteer with her coat, while Marcus and Sarah explained program services to a group of interested teenagers. "What I did know," Margaret continued, "was that the worst thing that could happen to me was losing my purse and having to replace some documents and credit cards. But the worst thing that could happen to them was becoming the kind of people who rob elderly women in parks. So the risk was worth taking." "Doctor." Williams shook his head in amazement. "Most people wouldn't see it that way. Most people haven't spent 4 years of their youth learning that survival sometimes requires trusting strangers." Margaret replied with a slight smile. "But I think most people are capable of that kind of courage when the situation requires it." As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Margaret found herself alone with Derek, Marcus, and Sarah in the community center's main hall. The space was littered with empty plates and coffee cups, evidence of the successful celebration that had just concluded. "So," Derek said, loosening his tie with obvious relief, "what happens now?" "I mean, the program is official, you've got funding and staff and everything. What's next for Margaret Chen? Community organizer?" Margaret laughed at his mock-serious tone. "What's next is that I keep doing what I've been doing, except now I have help and resources to do it more effectively. The program is just the beginning." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. About how this all started with one random encounter, and now it's become something that could help hundreds of people." "It's not random when you think about it," Sarah observed. Margaret was ready to help because of everything she'd experienced and learned throughout her life. "We were ready to be helped because we'd reached the point where we had nothing left to lose. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was just when all the right elements came together." Margaret felt a deep satisfaction hearing Sarah's analysis. Over the past 6 months, she'd watched all 3 young people develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of social systems, human psychology, and community organizing. They'd become not just program participants, but program advocates and informal counselors for other people facing similar challenges.
There's something I want to show you, Margaret said, reaching into her purse once again.
But instead of pulling out her medal, she withdrew 3 small wrapped packages. "I had these made last week," she explained, handing one package to each of them. "I wanted you to have something to commemorate what we've accomplished together." Derek unwrapped his package first, revealing a small pin in the shape of a bridge. Marcus and Sarah's packages contained identical pins, each inscribed with the words "Second Chances" and the date of their first meeting. "It's to remind you," Margaret explained, "that you are the bridge between my past experience and our future possibilities. That your willingness to accept help made it possible for others to receive help. That your transformation became the foundation for transforming how our entire community approaches these challenges." The 3 young people exchanged glances, and Margaret could see they were struggling with emotion. After a moment, Marcus spoke for all of them. "Margaret, we can never really thank you enough for what you've done. But we want you to know that we're going to spend the rest of our lives making sure that what you invested in us was worth it." Margaret nodded, understanding completely. "I know you will. But remember, you don't owe me anything. What you owe is to keep the cycle going, to help other people the way I helped you, to see potential where others see problems, to choose hope when fear would be easier." As they prepared to leave the community center, Margaret took one last look around the room where the Second Chances program had been officially launched. Tomorrow, this space would begin hosting support groups, job training sessions, and one-on-one mentoring meetings. The informal network she'd built over the past 6 months would become a systematic approach to addressing homelessness and unemployment throughout the city. But more importantly, the relationships she'd built, not just with Derek, Marcus, and Sarah, but with dozens of other individuals whose lives had intersected with hers over the past months, would continue growing and deepening. The program was just a framework for what really mattered. Human beings helping other human beings discover their own strength and potential. Walking home through the same streets where her journey with the 3 young people had begun, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday evening in Riverside Park. Her daily routine now included phone calls from program participants, meetings with community partners, and constant problem-solving around the complex challenges facing homeless individuals.
She was busier, more tired, and more fulfilled than she'd been in years. The medal in her purse no longer represented just past military service. It had become a symbol of ongoing commitment to fighting for human dignity and opportunity in whatever form that fight needed to take. As she passed Riverside Park, Margaret noticed a few people settling in for the night in areas where homeless individuals often camped. Tomorrow, she would make sure they knew about the Second Chances program. Tonight, she would simply appreciate the strange and wonderful way that life had brought her exactly where she needed to be, exactly when she needed to be there. The medal in her purse had shopped 3 young strangers 6 months earlier.
But what it had revealed about the power of second chances, the importance of seeing beyond appearances, and the extraordinary potential hidden in ordinary moments had shocked Margaret just as much. Some endings, she'd learned, were actually beginnings in disguise.